Hi everyone. Here I am back again to share with you the second half of my deep dive into Locomotive Breath by Jethro Tull. I'm sure you noticed, if you watched the first half, that I had some good fun hearing this song for the first time. And as many of you have been telling me, there are quite a few classical connections which can be made. One of the elements that I particularly enjoyed was the first bars of the piano intro, while it was just the solo piano alone. These first two opening notes in the bass line, right here, are so nicely placed and played so expressively, they could just as easily be the opening of a Chopin or Rachmaninoff piece. And then, as the right-hand chords enter, that doesn't really give us a whole lot of distinctive features to tell us to place the music in the jazz or the rock. Or it's like, is this a romantic era piano piece? Is it one of those dime a dozen pieces that were published for all the amateur pianists back in the days where everyone in America had a piano in their parlor for social and private entertainment and culture? The times when that was the era when nearly every well-brought-up young person had learned to play piano as a necessary, natural part of their education. It was the golden age of the piano. And it takes a while before we're clearly placed into the jazz and blues music in this song. And that moment happens when the guitar enters, which, as I mentioned in the first listen, feels like saxophone. It's a real jazz moment then. And it's immediately echoed by the piano shifting a bit and getting more improvisatory and conversational. For me, it places me in a certain era when the piano still featured prominently in social settings. And I think it works wonderfully as the first kind of brush strokes on a canvas, which is painting the picture of train life, in which the artist is making us maybe a bit nostalgic for times past. Think back to the era when there were smoking cars, dining cars, and other luxuries on trains, and it was a common way of getting around this vast American landscape. It was the era when traveling in general included a sort of social element, and any gathering place had some kind of entertainment, very often musical. I don't know if that was true on trains too, meaning I don't know if there were pianos and musical entertainment on trains, but I do know that there's a vast repertoire of music inspired by trains and travel by train. Everything from the hobo songs all the way to classical. And in fact, there's a classical song composed all the way back in 1840, which is very often cited as being the first train travel song ever. Well, of course, it depends on how you define train songs, whether that qualifies as the first. Because train songs aren't a specific musical genre or style. Some historians choose to go back earlier to a couple marches which were composed for the inauguration of a rail line, I think, if I'm remembering my facts correctly. It's been a while. But at least as far as I know, this song by Mikhail Glinka is the first known song to try to portray the experience of traveling on a train. And I think it really does paint a dazzling picture of movement. And I'm going to give you the link here to check it out, just as another element and connection in this whole musical world. Okay, so now back to Locomotive Breath. I also want to share a few pieces here from the classical repertoire which share some stylistic elements with this piano opening that I was talking about here. it's such a lovely opening, and it ebbs and flows, and there's color, and it's like looking through I guess I would say a little bit through a kaleidoscope and seeing the shapes and colors shifting and shadows and all of that. And it's so nicely laid out. Well, in the early 20th century, there was a lively appreciation for and interest in jazz among classical composers. And that might surprise some of you, because you might think of us as being very closed-minded to other musical styles, but actually historically, classical musicians have been very open and interested in other styles of music and how it can enrich their own work. And jazz influenced a lot of the works of that time. As a harpist, I play a lot of music by French composers in the late 19th, early 20th century period. And so I am especially aware of the jazz influences there, which were very often beautifully incorporated into the musical fabric of these classical works. In connection with this particular song, Locomotive Breath, I'm going to give you 3 different pieces to listen to, and maybe you will hear some similarities in one or the other, or maybe all of them, with the opening of Locomotive Breath. One is by Chaminade, and that's a French composer, right about this time period. She was a late 19th, early 20th century composer. And another one is by Fauré, who's a bit earlier, but also French. And then I've also picked Robert Schumann's Traumerei. And I'm curious if you will be able to figure out with your ears why I picked that one, even though it's from such an earlier era. So now let's get a little more into the technical elements of the music, because I want to show you in this song how the composer makes all of these different stylistic elements, from the luscious, free, romantic style opening into the jazz and then into the rock sections, all hold together and work smoothly from one section of the song to the next. And for that, we look again at these first 2 notes, which not only function to arrest our attention and make us think, what is this? Is it something beautiful? Is it something ominous? It could be so many different things. But also, it provides the architectural material, these 2 notes, which eventually help to seamlessly link us from this semi-classical opening through to the jazzy entrance of the guitar, and then again transition us to the entrance of the actual rock style part of the song. How does that happen? So these 2 opening notes, which make us arrive on the E, you hear them several times repeated in the introduction with the piano solo, where that is a feature of the music. Now later, the saxophone enters, the guitar enters, and it becomes jazzy and a little bit more, moving, carrying you around, swirling tonalities and sounds and stuff. And then we get to where it kind of pauses and rings here. And even in the score, the piano instructions is let it ring. Take your time. Don't rush there. But what do our ears want to hear? We've been trained by this introduction to know that the E comes next. And sure enough, now it comes, but very rhythmically. And that takes us into the next thematic piece of material in this bass part that's going to glue the whole piece together. And we hear this in the second half of the intro multiple times. And your ears will hear that. Now, it gets even better. The introduction comes to an end. There's this long pause and ring where then the guitars change. There's some these developing, growing sounds from the guitar. And then suddenly, we hear, this time, in the piano, actually no, in the guitars there. And that is the same set of notes. Only now it's all the instruments working together, more harmonically rich, the chords are fuller, and you hear that rhythm all the way through the rest of the piece. And it becomes the rock rhythmic motif or riff or whatever you want to call it, which happens repeatedly over and over as this piece progresses. So these same notes, which were set up in the opening introduction and then rephrased, reset in the second half of the introduction, then become the driving rhythmic feature of what I'm going to call the rock section of the song. And it's a really fabulous progression and development of a very simple idea, but it becomes the glue which holds the entire thing together and makes it this wonderful, well-organized entering of ideas and developing of ideas, rather than some random mashup of various unrelated musical sounds, ideas. And this is important if you want to go through so many stylistic changes in a single piece of music rapidly, if you don't want it to sound scattered and random. Of course, if you want to learn more about music theory and such, go ahead and check out the Ko-fi subscription levels, which grant you access to a lot of my exclusive materials. And I've named them Allegretto, Allegro, or if you want all of my offerings, Allegro Vivace. From this point, the song settles into its train clicking on the tracks feel, and we're now made aware of the journey itself, the motion and the movement. Now, in my research, I read that there is, in this song, a musical train motif, which Anderson apparently has used in a lot of his other songs as well. Well, obviously, I haven't heard any of those other songs yet. This is my first Jethro Tull piece of music. So I can't point out exactly what that is. But those of you who are more familiar with his music, you might be able to identify it, maybe even point it out to me, or just enjoy it for yourself. I'm sure I'll eventually find it as I listen to more of his music. So, now we're riding in this train, and you can hear the guitar and the piano and percussion giving us this wonderful sense of motion and traveling down the tracks, which, like in real life, it has the potential to become monotonous if all we do is sit there and not engage with the details around us. But to keep that from happening in the music, we have all these little elements coming in, which you heard me mention some of them in my first listen. Everything from the little rattles, which I noticed that to me, it reminded me of eating utensils or ice in a glass, something within the train atmosphere, the train environment, all the way to the flute section, which kind of points our eyes out of the train, out the window, to view the passing scenery. Now, I had to think about this flute feature a bit, because someone mentioned to me that they felt like the flute was kind of placed in there without a significant purpose, a reason for belonging to the song. That maybe it was just because he played the flute and he liked to include it, so he included it in all his songs without a particular reason for it. But after thinking it over, I do think that it is very well integrated into this song and appropriate. Because if we're looking at the music in terms of an artistic portrayal of this train journey experience, as I mentioned in the first listen, when I first heard it, the flute that is, it immediately brought to mind a pastoral setting, something outside in nature. And the reason it did is because the flute reminded me of a shepherd's flute. If you've never heard a shepherd's flute, you really should. So here's a little example of what one sounds like. It is also true that flute is a very common instrument in the classical music world. That's not the only place it lives. It features well in a lot of folk music. And so I think that it doesn't have to be classical. And actually in this song, it doesn't really take me in the classical direction. It gives a more of a rustic, folksy feel, not only in the actual melody being played, which is like this, and so on. Even the ornamentations which are used, the different decorations within the melody as the flute goes on, as well as the tone quality, make me think of this more rustic, folksy shepherd's flute style, rather than what I might hear in a classical symphony orchestra. But I like it, and I think it's a wonderful part of this picture, and I think it adds a nice dimension of pointing us outside the train's window to the passing scenery. We're not just looking inside where we're traveling. The voice also sounds rather folksy to my ears, and when I focus on it, it gives me a little bit of a different perspective of the song than what I've been looking at so far. Instead of feeling like I'm on the train myself, traveling, feeling the movement, it gives me more the impression that I'm hearing a traveler tell a story as we sit around a campfire. The voice is the narrator, telling us about the things he's seen and heard, observed, and experienced on some journey he took sometime in the past. And if that is the case, then the fade out at the ending isn't because I got off the train, but it's either because that's where the story ended as we're sitting around the campfire, or perhaps it's because that's where, in the story, the narrator got off the train. Of course, it's open to interpretation, and I think it can be understood from various angles, whether it's being told by a narrator at a later date, or whether we are involved on some level in this story. I think it's nice. Now, lyrically, I also found out something which was actually really surprising to me. As you may have noticed in my first listen, I was intrigued by the fact that the lyrics are telling such a miserable story about an individual on the train who is really in a terrible situation and seems to be powerless to make the choices and take the steps which would put a stop to the inevitable end. Well, the music seemed much more positive and carefree. And that's why I originally took the perspective that we are an observer of this person's situation and not the actual person. So we see him in his trouble, we understand that it's bad, we feel perhaps a sort of distant pity for him, but we eventually leave him behind as we go on with our own lives. But when I began to look into the inspiration for this song, I quickly found something that I would never have guessed on my own. It turns out that Locomotive Breath was actually inspired by Anderson's concern regarding overpopulation. And he explained, I'll read this quote to you. He says, "It was about the runaway train of population growth and capitalism. It was based on those sorts of unstoppable ideas. We're on this crazy train, we can't get off it, Where is it going? Without putting it into too much literal detail, that was what lay behind that song. Well, that throws a whole new element into the picture. And with that information from the composer, that different perspective, some of what I've said about my personal interpretation of the music, my first impressions could, and maybe even should, be reinterpreted in a different way. But I also think that is one of the things that I love about artistic expression, and music in particular. Very often, there's more than one way to understand it. And that doesn't mean that we are understanding it, when we understand it in our way, that doesn't mean we understand what the artist meant. But it means that what the artist created is able to be meaningful on many different levels, in many different contexts, to many different people. I think of it as a sort of recreation, an additional artistic creation that each one of us is able to form with a piece of music. I think that's a fabulous idea, where we are given something, this gift by some artist, and then we are also enabled by our own experiences to give it its own life within ourselves. Now, of course, when there is a clear, pointed, unmistakable message, it doesn't mean that that is a lesser or greater form of art. In fact, to communicate a very specific and direct message in a truly artistic manner is incredibly challenging and worthy of a master's touch. But I feel that there's a place for both within the art world. And fortunately for us all, music has room for all of that. So, do I like it? I guess I do like this one. I enjoyed listening to it. Again, it's not my standard diet of musical listening, but it was pleasant and enjoyable, and I do enjoy the opportunities of self-interpretation and self-storytelling which the music gave me. So I will probably be hearing this one again in the future, just for my own satisfaction. And I am curious to see, when I come back around to Jethro Tull in the future, how does his other music differ or remain similar to this? That's something I have to look forward to in the future. That's all for now. Also, remember the poll, which is in the community tab. Do go there, vote for your favorite band, drop a comment with your song of choice, because next month I want to review the winner for you. And if you want to receive notifications when I post new content, click the little bell next to the subscribe button and click this link to watch my first listen of this song if you haven't yet. I'll see you soon.